All right. Well, I'm really excited to have Jim Mellon, who just finished a new book, on the podcast today, on the interview, to talk about the new book. Jim, it's called Moo's Law, An Investor's Guide to the New Agrarian Revolution. I'm excited to talk about your book today.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and you are somewhere in Spain or Europe, far afield from where I'm in Seattle. So it's a little bit later in your day. So I appreciate you taking time. But, you wrote this book. It came out the end of 2020, and it's very much focused on the future food revolution. But it's kind of a new space for you. Why did you decide to write this book?
I've written a number of books before, as you know, and it's a great way for me to both meet the key opinion leaders in a new area that I'm interested in, and also to order my own thoughts about how we should be approaching investment in the area, and then at the same time providing a guide to investors who might also be interested in whatever sector we're looking at. And I also am particularly passionate about this one because, I'm not a meat eater, and I've got a great affection for animals who I think are very cruelly used in the modern intensive farming methods that you and I are very familiar with. And so my own driving force from this is the reduction in animal cruelty, but other people have different motivational thoughts when they're approaching this area, including climate change and human health and all that sort of stuff, all of which I'm interested in and actively promote. But the main motivating force for me is reduction and hopefully elimination at some point of the cruel way in which animals are misused by us.
And just to give people a little bit of background on where you're coming from, you've written a number of books. You're an investor, but you started, I think, in financial markets. So you've kind of had this long circuitous route to where you get here. But give people a little bit of background, what your earlier career was and how you ended up here.
Well, actually, I started in Hong Kong when I left university, and I had no idea what the job that I'd accepted would entail, other than it meant leaving my birth country, which I very much wanted to do. And then my company was on a bit of a growth tear, and I was sent to San Francisco. So actually, I'm quite familiar with the Seattle area where you are. And I just love the West Coast of America. And I was there for 4 years and, was lucky enough to be an analyst and then a fund manager for emerging US tech companies. So I met, as an example, the young Steve Jobs and young Bill Gates, not really appreciating the impact that they would have on the world, but nonetheless, it was a remarkable time. And then the company was so successful, even though I only owned a small share of it, it was enough money for me to buy the house that I'm sitting in here, nearly 30 years ago, in Ibiza in Spain, and then enough money for me to set up my own business, which has kind of branched out into all sorts of areas. I've been involved in property investments, in mining, and latterly, the last 15 years in biotech. So we've set up a number of biotech companies. And one of the features of biotech is that the process that's used in biotech in many ways is being used in the cellular agricultural revolution. And so I'm familiar with the processes. They're essentially biotech processes. And so it made it easier for me to talk reasonably coherently with the people who are at the forefront in this field, which, by the way, I think is, I love your website. I had a good look at it today. And, this is the future of the world, along with climate change mitigation and the fact that we're all going to live a lot longer, or longer than we expect. So those three are the great meta themes of our times. And food is just people don't realize how fast this is happening. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is. And thank you for the compliment. I mean, we kind of had a working thesis that over time, the next decade, we're going to see a radical reinvention of the food system. That was kind of a core belief of the spoon and a lot of our events. And it sounds like you've kind of had that. And you had this route through which you came into biotech. You wrote a book, I think it was called Juvenescence, and you had a company of the same name. that was all about biotech. And so you had this great foundation, but when you went and set about to talk to these 30 or so individuals, I imagine you learned a whole bunch talking to these folks, and I bet they were excited to be in a book.
Well, I've had no complaints. I actually spoke to Umar Valetti of Memphis yesterday, and he seemed to like the book. And Eat Just guy got in touch, and he seemed to like the book. So far, and Blue Nalu, Lou Cooper House, I'm actually a board observer there, like the book. So maybe they're just too polite to say they don't like it, but so far, so good.
What I don't like about some books is oftentimes you're reading about it, but it's very high level. But you actually talk to a lot of these folks, you profile them. So if someone's new to the market, they want to know who the key players are in fermentation or in plant-based food proteins or in cellular agriculture and culture meat. You give them that, which I think is great. And one of the people that you interviewed, I think, was Bruce Friedrich, who with the Future Food Institute, and he gave the foreword to the book. And I think he's really the perfect person for it. But one of the things that he talked about, as he teed up your book, is he talked about essentially the equation, right, of how much energy it takes to create a traditional factory farmed chicken, and what the output is and how inefficient it is. So I love that. But one of the things that had struck me when I was reading that is it doesn't seem like we're maybe there yet with the culture meat side or the cell ag side, or are we? Do we know ultimately when we get to scale with culture meat, what that equation will be and why it's maybe going to be much more efficient? Because I think that's one of the great debates right now in culture meat, right? Like how efficient it's going to be. We know that plant-based protein is going to be super efficient, or already is. That equation is well established. But will we get there with culture meat?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the reason the book is called Moo's Law is it's a riff off Gordon Moore's law, which he posited about nearly 50 years ago, which is he was the founder and CEO of Intel. And the idea was that every 18 months, the price of semiconductors would come down by half and the efficiency would double. And that law has more or less remained the same over those 50 years. The trajectory of plant-based, you're right, foods has been, and coming down in price has been very good, but I'll talk about that in a second if I may. But the cell ag has been faster from admittedly a very small base, but you obviously know about Mark Post doing his unveiling of the first cell ag burger in 2013. It was only 7 years ago. And it then cost about $350,000. And today they can make them for less than $10. But $10 is still exceptionally expensive compared to conventional meat, but the trajectory is there. So let's just look at the components of the inputs versus the outputs. As you well know, the principal costs of producing cell ag products are the bioreactors, which need to be scaled up to be efficient, the growth factors, and the nutrients. Those are the key factors. The extraction of the stem cells from the species is not particularly expensive. You biobank those as well. At scale, and we've got a pretty good scientific advisory board, we think that it will be 2.5 milliliters, which is nothing, from a cow will produce the equivalent of 7 or 8 cows worth of meat in 40 days, and that the input cost relative to the output, and that would be about 3,000 kilos, so 3,000, it's about 7,200 pounds, I think, of meat. But the cow, if you grew the cows to get to that amount of meat, you take about 28 to 30 months to do that. And so you can do this in 40 days. We think the input costs, that's assuming that we get the growth factor prices down, and they're already coming down fairly dramatically, assuming that people like Sartorius, Thermo Fisher can produce these massive, great big bioreactors, and the nutrient costs come down. We know that the basic nutrients are not very complex. At the moment, they're using biotech type nutrients, but the price of that should come down fairly dramatically. That the input will be 2.5 to 1. And that compares to, as you well know, a cow 25 to 1, a chicken somewhere between 8 and 9 to 1.
And cows are by far the most efficient. Chicken is more efficient, but still vastly more inefficient than what you're talking about.
Yes. And that's why, you said, Michael, I don't know whether you were recording or not, but during this conversation we've had, you said that, in the next decade, there's going to be a radical transformation. I completely agree with that. And let's face it, most consumers are not motivated, as you and I are, by issues of climate change or animal cruelty or too many antibiotics going into the food supply, et cetera, et cetera. They're motivated by taste, convenience, and price. And if the price of the stuff that we're hoping becomes very important to the world comes down to at or below, and I call it griddle parity, if it comes down to at or below the price of conventional meat, then the whole meat industry becomes completely disrupted and disruptable. And so our analysis, and we have, we've looked at this very carefully, is 2.5 to 1, which makes that possible. Now, in plant-based foods, you're right. The price of plant-based foods has been coming down, and Impossible's just lowered its price by 20%, I think, in the US.
Yep.
But there is a limit to that. So I think you'll get parity possibly in 18 months' time on some of the plant-based foods. But I don't think it's going to go a lot below that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Pat Brown, from the beginning, Pat Brown wanted to drive down towards price parity. His goal was always to attract the meat eater and not just attract the vegans, which I think is the big vision of what we need to get to. But what you're saying, and I think is interesting, and kind of getting back to Bruce Friedrich, is like, and Pat Brown would agree with this. We won't win this war that we need to win if we're going to grow to 10 billion in population. If we just attract vegans over to these new alternatives, we need to attract meat eaters. And I think that a lot, we could ultimately get a lot of them to the plant-based using things like hybrids and kind of inserting the medicine into the sugar, if you will, over time. And quite honestly, the plant-based stuff is going to get much, much better. But I think we're going to need culture meat to win a lot of them. What you're saying is we're going to drive down that cost curve. The input curve is going to be much more favorable than traditionally factory farmed, and we're going to get there. And am I also hearing you say we're going to drive that input curve down farther and make it even more efficient than plant-based?
Yes.
Interesting.
Absolutely. I'll give you some real-life examples of that. So in products that don't require regulatory process, like leather or threads, you're already looking at price parity. Vitro can now produce their leather at more or less the same price as, given the wastage in conventional leather, as the ultra luxury leather that they're selling to the big fashion houses. In seafood, Blue Nalu think that when they go on the market in the US at the end of this year, which is very likely, that their mahi-mahi will not be much more than 25 to 30% more expensive than the regular fish. And obviously that price comes down as they scale up, and they'll scale up dramatically. In the US, 60% of your meat is bought in the form of ground meat, so sausages, patties, etc. And that, I think, will be at price parity within 5 years. So, if you think 5 years is not a long time in the history of mankind, but within 5 years, the whole of the intensive farming industry will face a very dramatic threat to its existence. And I always use the example of the alternative milk market. You're the home of Starbucks in Seattle. 10 years ago, if you went into Starbucks, very few of them would ask for soy milk or almond milk or rice or oat milk. And today, it's 20% of the US milk market, and that's why Borden and Dean Foods have gone bust, because the tipping point arrived for them. And that's before you actually get the fermented processed milk, the Perfect Day and Noquo and so forth. So, we're when they actually have the whey and the casein in there, rather than just, the substitutes from plants. So, but for meat, I think it's going to be even faster. And seafood, definitely faster.
Yeah, I think the milk folks had no choice, and the new analogs for milk were just so good, and quite honestly, drinking milk as an adult, cow milk, is just not great with your. It's just not very compatible with just your adult digestive system. So it just made so much more sense. But you do talk about how you think traditional factory farming adherence to the old guard essentially is weakening. I think you called them agro-Luddites in the book. But I think if you look at oil as an example, incumbent industries don't give up very easily. I mean, in the U.S., the entire political system essentially is structured around old guard industry lobbyists. I mean, you could argue that the Republican industry core before it became Trumpy was basically kind of centered around oil industry economics and kind of keeping that status quo intact. Not to say that I think meat and dairy is the same, but I can see how they're not going to give up easily. Or am I wrong? I mean, is the meat industry, if we provide them with an alternative, like maybe you provide a conversion program for farmers to build bioreactors, it could be easier? Or do you think that it could provide some significant resistance? My feeling it could over the next decade or two.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. However, it's a layered argument because the multinational big food companies are like Danone or Nestle or Unilever are actually, I think, fairly agnostic about what they sell to consumers as long as it's legal and the consumers want to buy it. And they will jump on and already have, in the case of quite a few of them, and, including fast food chains like McDonald's, distributing the plant-based alternatives. Secondly, the Cargills and the Tysons and the JBSs of the world can see the writing on the wall, and that's why you're seeing them making venture capital investments in some of these companies, albeit small amounts, but they're hedging their bets already. And then the last layer is the people who actually farm the cows or the pigs or whatever, who are going to be highly resistant. Now, the biggest threat is the Cattlemen's Association, the various Cattlemen's Association in the US, who are well funded. They're a bit like the NRA, I'm not saying, yeah. I'm not ethically, but I'm saying that.
I mean, they want to protect. Understandably, they want to protect their livelihood, right? And it's hard to say I've been raising cows my whole life, and I suddenly want to move to this new industry. I mean, I understand their motivation.
Absolutely, and but the fact of the matter is that farming beef, as an example, is not a particularly profitable enterprise. So it's not like they're protecting some enormous margins. And so although they have got some money and some lobbying, and they've been using state legislatures to try and pass, anti-cultured meat and anti-plant-based meat legislation, they haven't succeeded very well in that. What you said earlier, I think, is dead right. That the companies need to co-opt these farmers into understanding that, this is a bit like the horse and cart, and the motor car comes along. They need to get with the program, but they might be able to make money out of the program. So how are they going to do that? Well, one way is to situate the bioreactors on their land and to produce the foods there under some form of license or some sort of agreement. The second thing is to grow crops for human consumption. They're much more profitable than growing the 70% of crops that go into the inefficient process of plant protein being converted into animal protein. And the third is that, if the land is not needed to, and it doesn't really apply so much to the US where you have plenty of land, but in Europe, for instance, we're very densely populated. But if the land is not needed to farm cattle or sheep or whatever, then it could be used for housing, or it could be used for recreation, or it could be used for really any worthwhile social purpose, and that could be very valuable to the farmers. So I think that will be worked through. In seafood, there is not an effective regulatory lobby, actually, and that's why I'm much more confident that, particularly as they unregulated the FDA, that they will be on the market fast.
I apologize, but Lou Cooperhouse pointed out the same exact thing, which I didn't know, actually, that there's a much less strong lobbying kind of resistance in seafood. And so Blue Nalu, and that's part of the reason Lou is attracted to it, maybe has a much easier path because there's not that kind of regulatory or not regulatory, but like almost lobbying resistance by the old guard?
Yeah, it's partly because the big seafood producers are largely non-American. And so they're not based in the US. That plays a big part. And then there's a kind of national pride or Texas pride, particularly in Texas, in the cattlemen's associations. I've written about them in the book. I think they are the biggest threat. In Europe, the lobbying is not nearly as effective as it is in the US, but the US is a very big market, as we all know. I just think it's a question of time. I mean, the pandemic has thrown up this undeniable zoonotic transmission risk that's caused us through a viral pandemic so much damage. Now, imagine if there was a bacterial pandemic because of the overuse of antibiotics and there were no effective antibiotics. And by the way, that's not just me talking science fiction here. That's a possibility. 80% of antibiotics go into farmed animals. Imagine if that happened. We'd look at the Black Death. I mean, 1/3 of us on the planet would die. It would be a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. So if it's made plain to consumers and others and politicians that if you remove the antibiotics into farmed animals, you remove the pandemic risk, or you reduce the pandemic risk, then surely that's a big selling point to politicians.
And you, in the past, have oftentimes, once you move into a new area, this is an area you've been moving into with your investment in biotech, you oftentimes will create a company. So the company or the book is Moo, focused on the new agrarian revolution. Is this an area that you expect at some point to start creating companies around or investing in? Talk about where you plan to go.
Oh, great question. So just to put it all in perspective, in Juvenescence, the company was started sometime shortly after the book was published, and Juvenescence is about to go public, touch wood, in the United States, have a valuation of around $1 billion. That's happened in 3 years. And we started a company called Agronomics about 18 months ago, so it predates the book. It's about $150 million listed on the London Stock Exchange. I'm the biggest shareholder. And Agronomics is now the biggest investor in the world in cellular agriculture. And that's all happened in the last 18 months. So we're moving at light speed on this. I mean, I want Agronomics and its other sister companies to be at least $1 billion by the end of this year, because the industry needs money, particularly as it scales up. And we will not win this war, and it is in a way a war, unless there's enough money coming into it to lubricate the necessary purchases by these companies and the scale up.
So the scale up to me is fascinating. I talked about it with Lou about how do we get to there. And you did mention these bioreactor companies that are coming from biopharma can possibly scale up. I think the investment in the scale up infrastructure is like a huge opportunity. People often focus on these culture meat companies creating the next prototype for whatever variant of meat. That's super exciting. But like, as we saw with the internet, like a lot of the early money was made investing in Cisco, which is, the old Axiom. They were creating the picks and axes for the gold rush. Are you investing in the picks and axes companies now? Is that an opportunity you see right now?
It's definitely an opportunity. We're not directly investing in it yet, but we will do, I hope. Chris Kerr, as you well know, is spending a lot of time looking at that area. The problem at the moment is because all the stuff comes out of the biotech industry, the food component of those companies is very diluted. And let's think about it. The biotech companies have extraordinary margins if they're making these sort of drugs or biologics or whatever. So in a way, they're not really that concerned about the input costs, or not as concerned as the food companies are, because margins in food are much, much smaller than biotech. If you look at a company like Sartorius, which is the world's biggest producer of the bioreactors, it's listed in Germany, but most of its business is biotech, and it's a very expensive share. So what we're looking at are novel companies that can produce media, companies that can develop the growth factors at a much lower price, And we're actively doing that, but we haven't yet made the investments. But that will be absolutely a key component of investing going forward.
Yeah, the inputs and the underlying kind of infrastructure ultimately is going to create a lower cost medium. And I like it. Reminds me of like when enterprise or big technology companies try to enter the consumer market. It's just a completely different cost structure. And so this conversion of biopharma and pharmaceuticals and biotech into the meat space, where people aren't paying thousands of dollars for a pill, but they're paying, $5 for a burger patty. It's a much different market, but ultimately it'll be profitable, but they just need to think in a completely different way.
Yeah, so we did it's all rough and ready analysis, as you well know at the moment, Michael, but we did an analysis on, how much it would cost to build at scale a plant to produce animal protein or animal equivalent protein for 100,000 people that lasted about 20 years. And we came up with a figure of about $100 million. Now, based on the economics of the conventional meat industry and the prices that could be achieved, we felt that the IRR on that project would be about 30%. So there's a very good economic argument for investors to participate in the scale-up of these companies. At the moment, what we're looking at is small pilot. I mean, all the companies that we've invested in have prototypes. They've all made something. You can taste it, you can feel it, you can whatever, you can fry it, do something with it. But none of them are beyond the 200-liter scale. So that's going to be the big execution risk and the big opportunity. And so we're trying to back the managements that we think, like Blue Nalu is a good example, where there's a veteran team there. They know what they're doing, and they've been doing it for a long time, to scale up. Because that'll be the next trick. But I will say that I think most of these companies will be sold in the next decade, because the big food companies, rather like Big Pharma buys biotech companies, will just buy in the innovation and then make the products at huge scale and distribute them. So there'll be very few, rather like Impossible and Beyond of the plant-based food area. There are very few that will be independently going out on their own. So the way I put it in the book is that there'll be fold, because there'll be some that will go bust, as there always are in any nascent industry. Sold, they'll be bought, and then there'll be bold, which will be just two or three of them that will go on to be world leaders. Yeah.
Is it analogous to the internet, right? Like in the early internet, we had Amazon, we had AOL, a few others, and because they were so early, and they were more mature than, say, a cloud computing company that started in 2010, or like a social network company, they were able to basically get enough market scale, market cap to be, start acquiring the companies that came and possibly could disrupt them. And then you also had the traditional guys like Time Warner in the US, or whatever telecom company you want to name, that also knew that they needed to go into the internet. So it's not, so you have your existing incumbents that were just old school, maybe 50, 100 years old. And then the new guys like Impossible that are early enough that they can start to acquire. I imagine Impossible, in 10 years will have a culture meet an egg replacement. Maybe they invest in infrastructure. Maybe they do like an Amazon. They start to kind of allow people to build on their platforms. You could see a similar market evolution, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes, you could. I did not, the two brands, the Pat and Ethan, I don't think they're best friends, but so I spoke to Ethan, and I had a choice. So you can either speak to one or the other, but not both. Pat Brown doesn't believe, as you know, that culture of meat is going to go anywhere. But Ethan is absolutely into it and thinks that Beyond will be in that area within a few years.
You're almost like the Bill Gates and Steve Jobs of future food space. You should talk.
I wonder which one they prefer to be. I don't know.
I mean, ultimately, they'll both be successful. They clearly already are. You should definitely talk to Josh Tetrick, who's I think a little bit more.
I interviewed him for the book.
I figured you did. Yeah. And full disclosure, like I said, I've scanned the book. I'm going to get through it. I recommend everyone else do it. But he seems a little bit more of a Switzerland. And I think a lot of these early leaders are, why they may be super competitive. They want the boats to all rise because they see this as a huge risk to the world that they're fighting against.
Yes, I mean, I was extremely encouraged, Michael, by the passion of the founders of these companies, as I spoke to the founders, and their reasons for getting into the industry. And they all have personal stories about how that happened, but most of them are, anti-animal cruelty. I think that's their major motivation in most cases. And then you're right, in terms of speed of execution, if I had to rank them, I would say that Blue Nalu is the furthest along. I know that Eat Just is on the market in Singapore, but it's a very small component of culture cells in the product that's there. Super Meat in Israel is pretty far along. I think Uma's, Memphis is relatively far along, and I think most Meatable will have products in Europe in the next couple of years. So it's a race. You can't really tell who's winning it yet, but there's plenty of room for everyone. In plant-based meats, the market is, obviously in the US you've got Impossible and Beyond, but the Europeans are pretty far along as well. So you've got Oatly, it's probably going to go for a $10 billion IPO. You've got Meatless Farms out of the UK. You've got Quorn out of the UK. You've got Live Kindly, which will probably go for an IPO as well, I would have thought, which is going to be very valuable. Another European company. But in cultured meat, the US is by far and away, or cultured foods, by far and away the world leader, not like in the plant-based stuff.
Who do you see as leader in fermentation? And by that, kind of the new school, both biomass fermentation and precision fermentation as people would define it. Do you see like Perfect Day, or who are you excited about in that space?
Well, it's got to be Perfect Day, hasn't it? They've got the most money, the furthest along. And again, they're a US company. We spoke to them as well, by the way. And so I'd say that absolutely the leaders in materials. I think that's an open game around the world, basically, at the moment. In pet food, I would say, which is a big market, not to be ignored, that's an open game. But the bulk of the cell and fermentation leaders are in the United States, and it's partly because of your very precisely honed system of venture capital interfaces with universities, researchers, and markets, and and the scale of the market for that matter as well. So you are absolutely the leader in that area. If I had to rank a number 2, I'd say it's Israel. Number 3, probably Singapore. And I'm disappointed in my own country because we should be up there. And maybe
which
we
is
will
the
be.
UK. You're adopting. I don't know if you're permanent or you're a resident of Spain now, but your UK is your home country, right?
I'm British passport holder. Yeah,
Yep.
And the UK, unlike the United States, which is an exporter of food, the UK is a net importer of food. 50% of our food comes from imports, and you and I don't remember it, but we've certainly seen it. The effects of the U-boats on the convoys in the Second World War, when America and Canada were providing food to the UK, the boats were being sunk at a dramatic rate, and there was a time when it was possible that the UK would be starved into submission. So having food security, I think, will be a very important aspect of the regulatory and rollout process of these foods. And so a country like Singapore, for instance, is very keen on it. And then the Middle Eastern countries import 95% of their food. So they are. I'm a big fan of the Middle East, and so I go there very often. And they're going to be very, very big supporters of this industry. So Hong Kong, where I lived for a long time, is also another one that has to import its food. They'll be right into this as well. So it won't be very long before we see a real industrial revolution around the world in this field.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. Singapore sees the strategic importance of building out this future food industry for food security and sovereignty. I think Japan, similar, Israel, lots of these early adopters are very strategic, and they're developing early leads, which is exciting. I want to get your opinion on a couple other topics just really quickly because it's interesting to me. I was I guess I should know, but I was surprised by some of the positions like the Future Food Institute or Bruce Friedrich had on bug protein. It doesn't seem like a lot of people think that as like, when you look at the equations of inputs versus outputs, is really maybe the best place to put our investments. Are you in agreement with that it really isn't like going to basically, I guess bug protein really isn't maybe a future food we should be betting on compared to these other alternatives?
Yes, I agree with Bruce. And by the way, just as a little point on the side, the proceeds of Moore's Law go to the Good Food Institute. So the reason is that although there is a big market for bugs in Asia and traditional market where you can eat locusts off a stick or crickets off a stick in Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia or whatever, it's because they have a humid and hot climate. And so the bugs grow very easily in those circumstances. In the Seattle, the UK, anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, that you expend a huge amount of energy trying to grow them. And so the cost economics just don't work. And apart from the cultural, factor of, I'm not going to eat this stuff, but the economics just do not work, which is why, as I also put in the book, there have been 2 or 3 companies in the US that sort of went nowhere, basically, trying to produce bug food. There's an English company that's producing it. They're having a little bit more success, but I don't think it's going to be a big market. And then we also try and avoid companies that are going after real niche markets that may or may not work, like the foie gras companies or the ones that are trying to produce fur, or the one from Australia that's doing kangaroos. I mean, who eats kangaroo meat in normal circumstances?
I agree with you there, although I do think one of the ways to maybe convert meat eaters to this idea of culture meat is to offer them exotics, right? Like meat that maybe they couldn't get normally. I think what Luke Cooperhouse has said about some of the kind of the more rare tunas and how they could bring that to the cost down to parity really quickly and maybe even blow much more quickly, it makes a lot of sense to me. So I think that argument is logical. I do want to ask you, though, on a separate topic about CRISPR and gene editing. It seems like, coming from where you've been coming from in terms of the biotech space, that's probably an area you've looked at pretty closely. What are your thoughts?
Well, in Europe, as you know, anything GM is just verboten. Right. They do eat GM food, but it's imported from the US or Brazil or where. None of the cell ag companies are using GM at the moment. As you know, Impossible can't sell in Europe because of the way in which the heme is produced using a GM process, even though it's not a GM food. My own view is that it's not necessary for the current wave of replicating individual species that we're familiar with. However, in the future, what's to say that we have to eat sheep equivalents or pork equivalents or beef equivalent? What about developing a brand new type of meat that incorporates all of them, is even more tasty, has more nutrients, more positive factors for human health? And that would involve CRISPR and the derivatives of CRISPR, because I am a really big believer in CRISPR. And I just want to tell you, Michael, my first book on biotech was written 8 years ago, okay? Just to show how the progress happens, and people don't know about it. CRISPR didn't exist 8 years ago. Right. It didn't exist except in a few obscure academic publications. Cancer immunotherapy, which is now the biggest part of the pharmaceutical industry, $260 billion a year, didn't exist 8 years ago. The cure for hepatitis C didn't exist 8 years ago. Artificial intelligence for the development of novel compounds didn't exist 8 years ago. The same will happen, as you rightly point out, in future food. But the first wave has got to be foods that people are familiar with, that they, that they would normally buy in the supermarket.
Yeah, and it may not be meat, right? It may be CRISPR becomes more relevant in plant-based food and creating. And maybe keeping some of these species of plants alive, right? I mean, if ultimately climate change means that certain breeds of coffee plants die off, you may be able to keep some of them alive by using a gene-edited form that maybe just survive in warmer heat. So I do think it's an important tool in the toolbox, both for plant-based and ultimately maybe in the future for animal-based food.
I completely agree. Do you know of a company in the UK called Tropic Bioscience?
I have heard of them. What do they do?
Well, they're the world leader in exactly what you're describing, which is to engineer in robustness into plants. And as an example, the banana is threatened at the moment because 99.9% of bananas are Cavendish, and there is a disease that's ravaging Cavendish at the moment. So they're engineering resilience. They're doing the same for rice, the principal staple food in Asia. And they're also working on coffee, and not just to avoid disease, but also to get rid of the bitterness in decaf coffee, or to grow effectively what will be decaf coffee without having to use the chemicals that are used in producing decaf. So it's a very exciting company, and we own some of that, I think. So that's
and the excitement for at least Pairwise is in the U.S. They're trying to do similar things with mustard greens and make those more palatable for the human palate. Not as using traditional plant breeding techniques. It could take years and years and years, maybe decades, but using something like gene editing just can accelerate that so much faster. So I'm wondering if you think maybe over time the European regulatory frameworks become more accepting, as the reality of climate change means that you may lose certain breeds of plants, or you just may not have certain foods available. Do you think that they become more accepting from a regulatory standpoint towards things like gene editing?
I think they will. And there's a novel food regulation of the European Union under which cell agricultural foods fall. And it's possible that the European Union could have cell ag meats on the market, not seafood, but cell ag meats faster than the United States, because there is no GM involved in the companies that are producing that. The UK, which is no longer in the European Union, is getting very excited about all this stuff. And I think they will be much more receptive to the GM products, because after all, why not? I completely agree with you. You know, we live in a world which is threatened by a lot more things than genetically modified food, which I would think in most cases is a very good thing.
Looking forward, just kind of close this out. You've looked at you have an analyst mind, a financial mind. You look at industries from that market perspective. Where does this future food industry sit in terms of potential? We're seeing the reinvention of travel with the micromobility, clean tech. We're seeing the reinvention of housing over time, I think. Where does food sit in terms of like an opportunity for both incumbents and investors, and maybe ultimately people who would be employed by it?
Great question. So at the moment, the meat industry, just meat alone around the world, is the size of the Spanish economy, where I'm sitting at the moment. It's about $1.4 trillion a year. In 10 years' time, given the uptake of animal protein in China and India in particular, it'll be about the size of the British economy, which is almost twice the size of the Spanish economy. So the growth in animal protein demand is enormous. So you're looking at a business of 2.5 to 3 trillion. You've then got 300 billion on top of that in seafood. And then you've got a huge amount in materials. And at the moment, the materials that are disruptable are threads, very big market, leather, huge market, and cotton, which is also an even bigger market. So I think you're looking at around $5 trillion of addressable value. Put that in perspective, that's about a quarter of the size of the whole US economy. So it's a massive opportunity for the early leaders in this field. 5 trillion is about 3 times the size of the entire worldwide pharmaceutical market. So it's
obviously a huge opportunity. And it looks like you're here for the long haul. Jim Mellon.
Well, I hope I am. Yeah.
well, with your biotech work, you should maybe know the the secret for long life. But Jim Mellon, thank you so much. Where can people find out more about Moo's Law, and tell us a little bit about where they can find out more about you?
Moo's Law is on Amazon and all the other platforms, and there is a website for Moo's Law that people can look up. You can look at previous books that I've written as well. But Agronomics is the company that we started. I'm pleased to say that it's had a phenomenal run on the London Stock Exchange. It's trebled really in the last month or so in share price. We're really mission aligned with you here. We want this to happen. We want it to happen fast. We want it to happen safely. And we want people to be eating something completely different. And most importantly for me, Michael, is I don't want the pictures of cows going to the slaughterhouse, the pigs being gassed to death in a horrible way, the chickens being distended because of the way in which they've been genetically edited to grow faster. I would like our fellow creatures on Earth to enjoy the kind of life that they should have and that we have.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for spending time. I encourage everyone to go out and get Jim's book on Amazon. And Jim, I hope to talk to you in the future. Thank you for taking time with us today.
Hope so too, Michael. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much.